I'm curious if you could speak to how your teaching interprets if there's anything beyond the I am. Specifically, Nisargadatta said something, and I might be misquoting, but something about staying with the I am until you go beyond it. And I've heard other teachers kind of vaguely reference something, and I don't know if that's what to make of that.
Okay. Well, if by the I am you mean the concept I am, the formulation I am, the thought I am, then yes, there is something not beyond that, there is something prior to that. What is prior to the thought I am? The experience of being. It's the experience of being. It's because we are aware of being that we are able to say I am. If we were not aware of being, we would say I am not. But can anybody say of their experience, I am not? No, of course not. Why? Because everybody, not just those of us that are interested in these matters, but everybody has the simple, ordinary experience of being. If your dogs and your cats and your chickens could talk and could understand our language, and we asked them, are you having the experience of being? They would say, yes, of course. My experience of being is my fundamental experience. That's the experience that enables us to say, I am. So is there something prior to the concept I am? Yes. There is the awareness of being, or there is being. Is there something prior to being? Well, just try to imagine it. You can't even actually imagine it, but just try to imagine that being was not. Now, what would be the status of something prior to being? It could not be. What would it be? Remember, according to this theory, being has not yet come into existence. Being, of course, is not something that comes into existence. Being is that from which everything else comes into apparent existence. But if there is no being, what could there be? So the idea that there is something prior to being is a little... So I'm not criticizing Nisargadatta. I don't know what he said or how well he was translated. There's always...
I certainly could be misquoting too.
Well, I'm familiar with his use of the term I am, and that it differs from... It's completely at odds with Ramana Maharshi's idea of the I am, but not because they were in conflict with each other, but because they were referring to something different. I suspect that Nisargadatta was referring to the concept I am, and Ramana Maharshi was referring to the experience of being from which we derive the certainty I am. But then I also allow for flexibility when someone is speaking about these matters in the context of a conversation with an individual. They might say something which makes sense in the context of the conversation. Then somebody hears that, plucks the quote out of... I've experienced this myself. Plucks the quote out of context, and then Nisargadatta said this, and it's obviously completely wrong, or Rupert said this. No, Nisargadatta's been dead long enough always to be right, but if you're still alive and you say something, you can definitely be wrong. So, and then you read it and you realize that what you've been quoted was quoted completely out of context. Out of context, it was wrong. But in the context of the conversation, it was provisionally right. And so I'm not sure. I'm reluctant to commentate on what Nisargadatta meant because I don't know the context. I don't know if he was translated correctly. Very often, people don't make a distinction between the statement "I exist" and the statement "I am," and there's a big difference between the two. Although sometimes they're conflated. So all this context has to be taken into account. But I'm quite sure. I've read I Am That so many times in my 20s that my copy is just falling apart and sellotaped together. And I'm quite sure that Nisargadatta was referring to what we're referring to here, but he used language in a very different way, in a way that sometimes superficially seems to contradict what we say here, but there's no real contradiction.
Thank you.